welcome to the Permafrost Community of Practice webinar series. Today we have Meixell Michaels, who's going to be introducing us to the Alaska Innovation Landscape Network, which is focused on permafrost technologies and accelerating climate resilience and adaptation. The goal of this meeting is to introduce the priorities of the Alaska Innovation Landscape Network, which aims to promote interagency and multidisciplinary collaboration and to bridge the gap between technology and end users on topics related to permafrost. Meixell comes to us from the DoD, where she is on detail with the Environmental R&D Program, the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, and Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. She is permanently located at the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, CREL, and she currently resides in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She has relevant background in geospatial analysis and permafrost extent mapping. She graduated from Michigan State in 2018 with an earth science degree focused on meteorology and atmospheric science. I will hand it over to Meixell and let her kick off her presentation. Welcome, Meixell.
All right, thank you, Miriam, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, or depending on wherever you are. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen here. So let me know if you can't see it, but it should be up now. Okay. So I'll just get started here. So as Miriam said, I'm Meixell Michaels. I'm the lead for the Alaska Innovation Landscape Network, which I've been terming AILN for short, just to kind of say it quickly and easily. And I'm currently coming to you on behalf of ESTCP, which is in the OSD's Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environment and Resilience. No need to remember that, OSD is fine. Okay, so let me click forward here. So Miriam already covered most of this, but just a little bit about my background here. So I am permanently at the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I've been there since 2018. And my background there is I'm a research physical scientist. As Miriam stated, I've mostly worked in geospatial analysis, terrain characterization, permafrost mapping. I worked a bit on analysis for expeditionary structures in the Arctic, and mostly with some of the Arctic infrastructure folks at CREL before I transitioned to actually being on detail in OSD with the climate policy team for about a year plus. And then just recently in June, I transitioned to another detail assignment, which is where I'm currently at, with STARTUP and ESTCP, which is essentially OSD's environmental R&D program. STARTUP is essentially the more basic research aspect of the program, and ESTCP focuses a little bit more on tech transfer. So those are both, very large programs within OSD, and just have a little bit of a different focus for each one. A lot of projects start out in STARTUP and then transition over to ESTCP once they have matured a little bit in technical application. And I went to Michigan State, graduated in 2018, studied earth science, focused in meteorology, atmospheric science. It's a little bit about my background. So before I jump into talking about the Alaska Innovation Landscape Network, I wanted to start out with the national network here. So the National Innovation Landscape Network, or NILN for short, is kind of where this effort has started. Within ESTCP, also as a partnership with USGS, and it is focused around 4 or so different pilot sites or regional landscapes, as we're calling them. So the one that I'm leading here for Alaska, 1 or 2 in the Southwest, 1 in the East, and 1 in Hawaii, which is going to be kicking up, I believe, next FY or so. And these different landscapes are focused around the climate hazards that we're really experiencing in those different regions of the US. The point of this slide is to really prove the point that we're experiencing a lot of different ecosystem transformations and changes, as you're all aware, in different areas of the US. And pace of technology transfer and solutions are not exactly keeping up with the pace that we need for climate adaptation, to really support the mission and to be resilient against these ecosystem threats. So that's kind of what we're trying to indicate here with this slide. And just again, to reiterate, so these are the 4 different regional landscape locations. So in Alaska, we're focused more on resilience, which is kind of a combination of climate hazards. Of course, we're starting with permafrost degradation as the main aspect of the network, which I'll get into a little bit later. But some of the other pilots are more focused towards wildland fire, specifically the one in the eastern landscape and the southwestern region. So these are the landscapes that compose the national network, which we're still kind of coordinating and getting running and developing a strategic framework for how this should look and how all these landscapes should coordinate together. But that's kind of the overall look there. So one thing I wanted to point out here is that the purpose of these different regional landscape networks are to really operate at the intersection of science, management, policy, and interagency partnerships. So we're not just talking here about the research and technology, but we're also talking about the natural resource managers, installation planners, et cetera, who are responsible for climate adaptation and installation and community level. We want to also collaborate, of course, with our partners across agencies, and we want to have this somehow be codified in policy as well. So those are the different aspects that we're trying to work with here as we're creating these networks. We mentioned Sentinel Landscapes a little bit. That's actually a program out of OSD's REPI program, which I believe is Readiness, Environmental Protection, Integration, or some other long acronym. That is really focused on the intersection of land management and the DoD mission. So some of you are probably familiar with the Sentinel Landscapes. So we're also trying to target those existing collaborations and connections and really build off of what's already there. So that's partially why we have some of the regional landscapes in the places that we do. Okay, so next slide here. So here I'm trying to show that this is our quote unquote traditional model for how science and technology how the science and technology process works. So you have products, systems, and tools that are invented or, mostly part of the startup process. If you're familiar, ESTCP investment really comes into when technology is at the prototype, pre-commercial, commercial stage. And technology is at the stage where it's also maturing. And then there exists this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this valley of death, as we would call it, between getting these technologies actually to the people who would be using them. So to the end users being the installations and the community. So, we have all this great research and technology that comes out of these programs, and sometimes there exists this issue where it's really just not reaching the folks that it needs to reach, and it kind of becomes a little bit stagnant. So this is how we would view the traditional process for technology development as it is now, as being inadequate for DoD managers to plan for and adapt to accelerated change. So through the National Innovation Landscape Network and the Alaska Network here, what we're trying to do is to have this model of co-production. We use the word co-production quite a bit here, actually. So co-production through these innovation landscapes, what that looks like is, and again, hopefully you can see my cursor, you'll have a lot of projects through startup, and you have statements of need that come out for what kind of calls for proposals go out there for what startup is looking and investing for. And you have research, tools, technology that comes out of that program and goes down along this, I guess you could call it a Mobius strip here. And then that technology gets translated into ESTCP. A lot of projects get moved from SERP to ESTCP, like I mentioned earlier. And then those also inform the topics. So for SERP, you have statements of need. For ESTCP, you have topic areas.
Yeah, I don't think he's done any. He'd never done
that come out as a. We might have a hot mic here.
Yeah, probably not.
That come out in solicitations. And then through the Innovation Landscape Network, what we're trying to do is have, so those research tools and technology coming out of ESTCP going to the end users, have their feedback, then refine those tools, go back into ESTCP if they need further refinement for further calls for proposals and topic areas, or if needed, if there's established a bigger need or something further that we need to push back out to CERTUP, there's also that that opportunity too. So really just trying to emphasize here that we want to create, a big feedback loop between the end users and research, and make sure that there's open conversation, connection, and collaboration here, so that their feedback is really informing the research innovation process and what CERTUP and ESTCP in particular puts out for their calls for proposals and solicitations. So this is also kind of a part of the new way we're trying to look at things here, where we're trying to really incorporate partnerships. So we have 27 million acres of DoD managed land. We can work with our partners in a dynamic sort of way, and create these installation landscapes with our partners as well for demonstration sites for some of this research technologies, tools, et cetera. So kind of trying to emphasize that we're trying to be a little bit more dynamic about this, move a little bit quicker, account for accelerated tech transfer, accelerated climate adaptation, and we want to involve our partners in policy in this as well. So the main point to take away here really is just that we're foreseeing this as co-production being able to reduce the time for problem identification by having these teams of managers and scientists already together and collaborating, and being able to demonstrate some of these technologies. Okay, so some of the goals specifically for the Alaska network are twofold, really. One is to institute this network of interagency partners in Alaska, and the second is to focus on facilitating co-production and technology refinement. So that it looks like, investment in some of these research tools that are coming out, and getting other partners as well to be interested and invested in funding some tech refinement for these tools, and also to make sure that we're really collaborating with all of our partners. And as I may have said earlier, to bridge the gap between installation personnel and research technologies that are ready to be demonstrated, evaluated, and refined. And we're initially focusing this network on data tools and technologies related to the effect of permafrost degradation on built and natural infrastructure on and off installation. So not just focusing on inside the fence line, but also trying to help communities as well and have their input here on tools and things that would be helpful for them. I do foresee, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the network expanding to outside of this as well. This is certainly, we're using it as a unifying initial effort to center around for this network. And I just foresee us being able to expand to cover other climate hazards in interior Alaska as well, and coastal effects also. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to just talk a little bit about the CERTUP and ESTCP Arctic portfolio. So I mentioned earlier, CERTUP is a little bit more basic research, ESTCP is more applied. And to give you a sense of the previous and current investments that they've put forward for the Arctic portfolio, we have about 10 different organizations or so that have been funded through CERTUP and ESTCP, 20 projects, 11 completed, 8 in progress, 1 selected, for a total of $28 million of investment. And this network is the opportunity to really further CERTUP and ESTCP's investments in Alaska, in the Arctic region, and in the tools and technology we're developing in that area. So just to give you kind of a view at a glance of the current investment as it stands so far. And to break this down a little bit more to different research areas that we funded so far, we have ecosystem transformation, so understanding how Arctic regions are changing with climate, engineering solutions, developing resilient infrastructure, fire resilience, and understanding impacts of permafrost thaw. So that's about the breakdown in this pie chart over here to the different areas that we funded for research. So engineering solutions is the bulk of it, which also does a little bit overlap with permafrost thaw, fire, and then also ecosystem transformation has been a huge part of it, which is more of the natural infrastructure piece. And then going off of that, I thought, okay, well, if we're trying to figure out how we're trying to build up this network, we need to take a little bit of a closer look at it. So about half of the investment has been in built infrastructure. About half of the investment so far has been in natural infrastructure. So all of this bidding, et cetera, is just trying to give, you know, us a little bit more of a closer look at what have we invested in currently, where we may want to invest more in the future. And so that led me to our initial focus and adaptation priorities, as I mentioned earlier, being on permafrost thaw and built and natural infrastructure. So for built infrastructure, mostly looking at buildings and linear infrastructure, natural infrastructure, mostly looking at wildlife habitats and hydrology and groundwater flow effects. Another area of focus for this network specifically that has been identified as a need is a geospatial database repository that can be used landscape-wide and that can be readily available and have climate resilience data. And looking specifically at having the necessary parameters to consider for the end user. So for installation master planners, et cetera, you know, what kind of data layers do we need to consider where it's suitable to build on permafrost, where it's not? That can just be one aspect of it. But there's many tools and technology out there with all of this data that is usable and really not readily available, as I'm finding, for many folks across Alaska, the Arctic, or just they're not aware of it, or they just haven't been collaborating on it. And so this was actually a slide I presented at the workshop I hosted last week, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But you know, there are lots of good efforts going on here, and how can we collaborate on these? And I'm not trying to prescribe here what this should look like, but simply posing it as an opportunity for the network to really formulate what this looks like and to really assess this need and to come up with a solution and just further our efforts. So it's more of a jumping off point, if you will, for where we may want to go in the future and something we may want to collaborate on. So for strategy and way forward, this is kind of how I foresee the network moving along as it develops further here. So we've already been past step one. You know, we've reached out to an initial group of potential partners and solicited interest. Step two was hosting the kickoff workshop, which was last week, August 28th. And so now we're really at step three, which is establishing participation with our partners and the landscape leadership team, and really seeing who is invested in this further and would like to be part of the team that develops where we go and our strategy and implementation plan. And so on the right here, I've just listed out some of the organizations so far that have been involved, attended the workshop, and have been engaged so far with this effort. And so phase two of this will be formalizing the leadership team and our partners, establishing our recurring team meetings, developing our strategy and implementation plan. I talked a little bit about competitive solicitation opportunities. So CERP and ESTCP has and is continuing to offer competitive opportunities for solicitation within this realm. We actually just released not too long ago a solicitation that I actually posted on the IRPIC website earlier today, so you can find it there. But it's for climate resilience and DoD key geographies. That's actually a solicitation that closes on September 14th. And really this open call is trying to target some of the efforts that I've mentioned earlier in my slides for the Alaska network. So key geographies being regions of particular interest for DoD, and Alaska is certainly one of them. The call really is trying to point at technology transfer and getting input from end users and kind of moving things forward. It's not supposed to be about really collecting or generating extensive climate information, but more about things that are already out there and kind of moving them across the finish line, which is really what this network is about. But along those lines, the idea here is to also, you know, get interest from our partners and have them invest in these as well, and also fund some of their own solicitations so that we can have, you know, multiple opportunities for this research to be advanced further. Another part of the network that we see here for the future that we would like to accomplish really would be to identify and deploy some of this technology at transfer nodes. So a lot of the technology that we've seen in some of our CERP and ESTCP projects is really applicable for the Arctic, but also we were wondering, okay, could we potentially fund these, refine them to scale them to other locations as well? You know, are there certain strategies or SOPs that folks are using in the Arctic that can really be scaled to other locations, and how can we just refine those further and make sure that the new standards for practice are communicated across the landscape is essentially what we'd be trying to accomplish there. And then in turn, science translation. So has any of this research or technology, any new engineering or design standards, are they being understood by the affected communities of practice? So if you're, you know, an engineer who builds in the Arctic and you are now subject to these new standards for building, has that been communicated to you? Do you know what that means? Do you know how to use them? Is it applicable for you? Is it applicable everywhere? That kind of a situation. So that would be what we would foresee as a science translation position. So last week on August 28th, I was up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I hosted a kickoff workshop for the Alaska Network, co-located with the Alaska Defense Forum, which was also last week, 29th and 30th. And the purpose was really to meet with folks, to have some researchers who work in this area present on the efforts that are currently ongoing for them, and to get some of the end users at the installation level in the room to have that conversation and to begin as a jumping off point. So, you know, this is what we're working on. This is what we're seeing from the research side. How does that affect you as end users? What are your needs and your challenges at the installation level? What are you seeing? And how can we help you? Is essentially the conversation that we had last week. And then this is just to show a little bit of a representation of the folks that we had in the room there. So, you know, we've solicited interest across multiple organizations so far, but still looking to expand further and gather some more interest as well. So the different folks that we had present at the workshop last week are up on the screen here. Just to go over this a little bit. So we had Mr. Kevin Biela from Corel presenting on permafrost thaw and considerations for Arctic construction and giving a little bit more of the background and the basics. Bruno from NREL Alaska, which used to be the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, is now National Renewable Energy Lab Alaska campus, talking more about sustainable buildings, building envelope performance, and how buildings are really adjusting if there's permafrost thaw or subsidence. Rosa Affleck from Corel, who is talking about a new ESTCP project that she has funded that's kicking off for climate resilient infrastructure in cold regions. So that's using something like the Mission Dependency Index to do a thorough analysis of what climate hazards are being experienced at the installation level across Alaska and how resilient infrastructure is at that level. So that project kicked off recently. Anna Lildahl talking about, from the Woodwell Climate Center, talking about the Permafrost Discovery Gateway and the new grant that they have just received to work on tracking permafrost thaw through artificial intelligence. And then Dr. Scott Rupp from the University of Alaska Fairbanks talking about the Arctic EDS tool, decision support for engineering, design, and planning, which is a tool that is actually one reason why I thought about the geospatial database repository, because it's a good starting location for inputting some of those data layers that are really necessary for construction, engineering, design, et cetera. So that was the representation of presentations that we had at the workshop last week. And they all complemented each other very nicely. And then we posed these framing questions to the group. So what are we trying to accomplish today? Well, we're trying to establish what end user climate resilience priorities are, how their input can inform the research and innovation process, what their future challenges and needs are, and what sort of tools, data, technology, et cetera, is ready for refinement, demonstration, and evaluation at the installation and community level. So these were really the driving questions for our conversation for the day, for feedback from the end users, from the researchers. And as we move forward, so some of the key takeaways I got from this conversation were that, number one, groundwater and hydrology flow effects were really a driving concern for installation personnel. So specifically at Eielson Air Force Base, they're seeing a lot of issues with the water table and groundwater levels being really high, causing a lot of flooding and causing runways to close. So that was a very driving concern for them. Another one was that end user input was largely based on anecdotal experience rather than community of practice standards. So that being that there are a lot of folks who are managers of lands, of training lands, or managers of the installation level who may be active duty, maybe in rotating positions, may not have the anecdotal experience that some others have, who have been in that position for a very long time and know what considerations you need to be thinking about when managing those lands. So for one example, we had someone who was in a rotating position, so very new to that position in active duty, who hadn't actually heard at all of permafrost or any sort of considerations that they would have to think about for managing those lands of installation. Conversely, some folks had a lot of experience in that, but it seemed that it wasn't really being operated by community practice standards, but rather, how long have you been there and what kind of anecdotal experience do you have? So that was another takeaway that we got from the meeting. Another one was that we saw, architectural and engineering firms may tend to overbuild in the sense that instead of engineering buildings specifically for the standards that are needed for where you're located, in order to avoid any issues later on, there's a lot of money being thrown into these to the Arctic construction to overbuild so that there are no issues at all whatsoever, even if it's not really necessary or relevant at all for the location that you're building in. So, there's an ability here, as I see it, to really get some more specific feedback and integration so that when we are considering constructing these areas, they're built to specification and not necessarily completely overbuilding. For some of the end users, for some of the folks at the installation level who may have to know some of these things, it was a little bit easy for them to follow the research that was going on and some of these aspects about permafrost, even if they had no prior background about anything to do with permafrost. So that was some really positive feedback. One outcome that we saw here was that we can now increase the number of stakeholders and managers that are inputting the research team. So essentially what that would mean is that when these calls for proposal solicitations come out, requesting for topics that are targeting some like the ones here that I was talking about earlier, we may now have, since these connections have already been formed, an ability for researchers and managers to actually have already pre-coordinated on what they may want to submit as a proposal. So instead of someone having a research idea, submitting it as a proposal, and then finding collaborators and partners to accept technology after the fact, if they already have those connections established, then they can communicate on that and work on proposal submissions together. And so once it's submitted, if it happens to be funded, those connections have already been made, and you're not then trying to create something that then would be applicable to the end user community, but they have no knowledge of it. And so then their input can be considered. So it makes the process a whole lot more efficient. So that was just another outcome we had from this. And then just, making further connections for folks to collaborate. We had a lot of people who were extremely interested in some of the research technologies that were presented and wanted further information. Folks at the installation level who, just didn't know about what was going on, weren't aware of some of these research technologies and projects that were ongoing. Okay, and so this is a session that we had during the workshop for laying out priorities. It's about 15 minutes. It was interactive. We had this right after introductions, right before research presentations. And we asked our end users, what are your top climate adaptation priorities? What are you considering? What's important for you? We want to hear from you. And so this is the feedback that we got. So we asked folks at the beginning of the day this question, and we took down in this list over here what they had mentioned at the beginning of the day. And then after we had talked, after we had our research presentations, we revisited this question at the end of the day, and we said, what has changed? Has anything changed for you? Are there any things that you've seen today that are causing you to think, okay, I need to really consider this. Now I have a new priority. And this is what we came up with. So at the beginning of the day, we were talking about access to remote sites, energy efficient buildings, permafrost thaw effects on infrastructure, ground mobility in the Arctic, changes in groundwater level, coastal erosion, standoff capabilities, etc. So a whole bunch of different things. And at the end of the day, this list was mostly the same. It was mostly maintained, but we had a few things added to it. Power needs, effects of frost heaves, mission impact for installations with runways, mitigating black ice. And then we talked a little bit about having available map products for facilities that I kind of mentioned earlier, by combining these existing projects with in-situ measurements, and then also having on-site testing as well. So our priorities changed slightly. We also added a few there. Once conversation got going and folks really got thinking about what was important to them, that's kind of the culmination of ideas that we had for the day. And so now I just want to pose it to the group here. This is actually the end of my slides. What are your top concerns and priorities with permafrost degradation in the Arctic? And do any of the things you see here that end users have identified as needs for them, does any of that resonate with you? Are there questions about some of the things we talked about? So just opening it up now to kind of hear from you all and see if any of that addresses some of the areas that you're also working in.
Thank you, Meixell. That was a great overview. Yeah, I'll open it up to any questions or feedback or comments that you may have based on the questions that Meixell outlined here or other permafrost related topics.
Hi, I've got one. So I'm looking specifically, well, first of all, hello, it's nice to see you today, Meixell.
Hi.
Thank you for taking the time to follow up with this network, this permafrost network, and talk about your work and your work in Alaska and place it in context for this group. So thank you again for that. I'm looking at top concerns and priorities, and these are fantastic. And there's one that I think is implied, but I would really like to state it directly, and that would be foundations for buildings, whether it's housing or other new construction for you name it. And though I'm seeing the infrastructure impacts and in regards to hydrology, I just want to be clear about some of the additional critical infrastructure by name being foundations of buildings. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, that did come up as well a lot with the NREL folks who are also working in that capacity. And yeah, you know, I got a chance to tour a little bit around Allison and Fort Wainwright and kind of see some of the buildings there that were having issues. And yeah, certainly that is definitely an issue, foundation on buildings. So thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yes, go ahead, Vladimir.
Yeah, well, yeah, I had the same actually question about why it's just regards to hydrology. I would guess that impact on foundations of any kind of infrastructure itself by thawing permafrost will be very substantial without changes in hydrology. Of course, hydrology may make it even worse, but yeah. What I would like to say that probably approach to the kind of what is urgent, what we need to do. I think it's kind of missing here the say towards observations and forecast. So I think when you just react to changes which are already happening, it's important, of course, to have some capabilities to react on already happening changes, but I think also very important to try to predict or envision changes which are coming soon. And for that, only what you can do is to observe, monitor state of permafrost, how far it is from starting thawing, and also based on these observations, do some sort of predictions or projections into the future. And of course, remote sensing you mentioned, and there, I see there's some from participants somewhere there. It was very well represented, but remote sensing in any kind of gives you only information when permafrost is already changing. But if it's stable, you pretty much don't see too much from the terrain or changes in buildings. So if permafrost is not changing, you don't see it. And for that, you need really to look into permafrost from inside and see what is the thermal state of permafrost is, and be able to predict or project these changes in the near future. So I think that's very important kind of activities, which is not reflected very well, at least what you presented. Maybe it was discussion on that, but it's not presented here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for observation forecasts, I did notice that there's not a whole lot of incentive at the installation level to really consider those factors beyond just what are we seeing currently and what's already happening. And that's why, you know, some of the tools that I mentioned earlier, the, you know, online repositories for that kind of data, I'm hoping we could, you know, include some more modeling predictions there. I know certainly the Arctic EDS tool does have some GIPL modeling in there, and I believe the AI tool that On is developing, these are just, you know, based off projects that I know about, is really looking to kind of track that for future predictions. But yeah, certainly important. I really didn't see from the folks I talked to at the installation level that that's something they're considering. They're kind of just looking at how are things currently. In fact, it's really interesting. So you mentioned too at the beginning about, you know, there's such a focus on hydrology effects. That's mostly at AILN, that's what they were looking at. And I was very interested in the fact that that was what their main concern was. At Fort Wainwright, they were very adamant that they're not having any issues with permafrost thaw. They're like, nope, everything's good here. It's fine. We're not seeing any effects. It's like, well, probably, you know, maybe your structures are safe as they are. That's fine, whatever. Maybe you're not seeing that many issues or difficulties. That doesn't mean that a lot of money, time, and planning hasn't been spent to make sure that that wouldn't happen, or that things haven't been overbuilt by specification. So just wanted to kind of add that as an anecdote here, what I've just noticed from the folks at the installation level. And it's not really supposed to be a dig or anything. It's just, you know, I'm trying to understand the communities better so that our conversations are more meaningful.
Yeah, and actually it's a good example, and probably the difference is in ice content in permafrost. So it could be, and that's another way, I mean, another subject to look at it, and be aware about permafrost ice content, which again, there's lots of gaps in our knowledge about it. So that's another one. Not just thermal regime of permafrost, but amount of ice in the permafrost, and the difference between Wainwright and AILN may be exactly in that, because Wainwright is pretty much sitting on the gravel, frozen gravel mostly, I guess.
Yeah, no, there was Kevin gave a nice overview at the workshop to some of the installation folks about, you know, difference between thaw stable and unstable permafrost. And I think it really helped to kind of clarify for them what that means and why you may be seeing some effects at some installations and not at others. So for instance, Fort Greely mentioned that they haven't seen any of those effects, which, you know, might be fine because they're farther south.
And mostly on the gravel again. So.
And mostly on gravel, yeah.
Yeah, so the importance of the terrain as well as the ice content will be useful in understanding future changes for sure. I see Jonathan has his hand up.
Yeah, hi. I was really interested in the co-production concept and who exactly are your end users? It sounds like it's people who manage facilities at these various bases, DoD bases. Is that right?
Yeah, so for the most part, the end users are the planners, the master planners, the natural resource managers, any engineers, designers, folks who are mostly so far in like DPW environmental planning are mostly the folks that we've talked to on installation. We've not fully incorporated the community aspect yet into the network as we're just getting started here, but that is also an end user community here. I would really like to include some of the tribal native Alaska folks into this as well, if it can be helpful for them. So I would say community level, there are definitely end users as well. I think that actually may be best accomplished through the REPI program because they have a connection with some of the let's see, with some of the, actually, sorry, not REPI, I'm thinking OLDCC, it's Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. They have kind of an established OSC connection with the community. And also NREL, to my knowledge, from what they presented on, is doing some work with the community as well in terms of sustainable building design and working with tribal communities, and then kind of handing off those designs to them and having local labor contract that out for building in the in some of those villages. So yes, but to answer your question, I would say end users would be those installation personnel and hopefully to add the community at some point as well.
I'm seeing a couple of comments in the chat. So Lisa Sheffield Guy mentioned, I would add ice cellar thaw to this list. Many are thawing and flooding, causing major food insecurity challenges for rural Alaskan communities. And then Ed Yarmuk commented, I agree with Vladimir regarding monitoring the thermal state in order to predict the future. And Jonathan also noted earlier that IARPC has an objective deliverable under PA3 to create an infrastructure map for the Arctic.
Excellent. I'm actually writing this down now. I had at the workshop, I live edited the slides, but since they're in presentation mode, I'll just leave that for now and just take everything by hand. But yes, definitely those are good points. I'd actually definitely like to see that objective for infrastructure map for the Arctic. I'm not so familiar yet with IARPC's goals and task orders here, but yeah, I would definitely be interested in seeing that.
And just to note, we have about 5 minutes left, and we're going to have to do a hard stop at the top of the hour because I think Meredith is trying to use the same room for another meeting after. But any last questions or comments?
I guess I have one quick clarification. That you mentioned contaminants, and I'm curious what the concern was about contaminants, whether it was known contaminants within the infrastructure on bases, or was it contaminants that are currently stored in permafrost that could be released upon thaw?
Yeah, so it was mostly infrastructure on bases. So the contaminants that were mentioned here was, again, mostly an issue at AILN, where the rising water table and groundwater levels are causing some flourishing, you could say, of PFAS. So that was really the issue with contaminants that they were referring to.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I guess I would just also add that there are a lot of contaminants that are stored in permafrost, like mercury and other trace metals that can affect drinking water quality and can get incorporated into the food web. of watersheds and things like that. So just thinking about it from the other side of contaminant mobilization with thaw, previously frozen contaminants.
Yeah, that's actually that's a really good point. So I had been pointed to that issue by someone else recently as well about access to safe drinking water. And I think that, you know, that fits in perfectly within the scope as it stands so far for our network to address that issue. And so I'm hoping to get some involvement from folks with aspect to, you know, like research proposals in that area, to kind of focus on that, because that's not an area I have much experience in myself, but I do think it would be really important. And I've heard a lot of interest from other people as well. Also, I'm gonna just put another plug in for the for the solicitation that we have out, because it's really a perfect chance to try and target some of the areas that I briefed on today, in terms of, you know, funding for research. So again, I posted that on the IARPC website under my name, so it should be pretty easy to find. And yeah, I'm hoping we generate a lot of interest for that. And I'm more than happy to help people too if you have questions further, you know, offline about ideas you have and stuff like that, to help kind of guide you, because it's a little bit more of a nuanced solicitation, as it is really heavy on the tech transfer aspect, less so on the climate information development. So yeah, so happy to help there.
Great, thank you. Any last minute lingering thoughts or comments? I think Meredith is probably needing to kick us out pretty soon here. All right, well,